All right, good afternoon, everyone. We've reached just a little bit after 12 o'clock, 12:15 to be exact. And we are here for today's wellness break. Again, I'm Crystalline Montgomery. I'm the naturopathic doctor and acupuncturist with the mHealth Fairview Psychiatry Wellness Team. So today's session, we are going to talk about how to regulate cortisol levels naturally, sort of part of the ongoing series on how we can support our bodies in recovering from stress, because there's a lot of stress around nowadays. It's always existed, and it's nice to know all the different ways in which we can support ourselves, because we can't always take stress out of the picture, but we can sort of provide ourselves with tools to manage it. So I'll jump right in and get started. For those that have been with us all along, we are nearing the end of our wellness breaks, coming upon August 31st. So this week we're going to talk about regulating cortisol levels naturally. Next week, my colleague Debbie Cohen will be back to do some mindful movement for mental health. She was with us last week. If you didn't get a chance to be a part of her session last week, I'll encourage you to view that session or any other session for that matter by going onto the YouTube channel. If you go in and just type in Psych Wellness, you should come upon it. We're still kind of working out the kinks and hoping to get it so that it just pops up right on your screen if you do that. Otherwise, we are still sending out links to replays, but previously you needed the link in order to see the replay, whereas now you can anyone can go in and view it after the fact. So again, we've been doing this all summer. For those that are maybe just joining us for the very first time today during our live session, I'll just remind you, I'm recording this session so we can put it on YouTube. If people have questions, I want to encourage you to ask your questions. Ideally, this is more of a discussion-based session. COVID has made that a little bit more challenging with our online series. However, you can type in any and all questions into the chat box. So if you're on your Zoom, you should see a chat button, and go ahead and you can just type in those questions, and I will be keeping my eye out for those questions as we go through today's session. So. Just a reminder, I don't have any financial relationships with any labs or supplement companies or anything for that matter. So if I happen to mention anything, whether it's a lab or a supplement or a brand name for that matter, it's purely out of just trying to provide an educational example. It's not in any way am I trying to endorse them or whatever. So, and again, this information is for you to use to your benefit in terms of informing your conversations with your health providers, to help you understand what kind of conversations you want to have with your healthcare providers in order to optimize your own health. I'm a doctor, but I'm not necessarily your doctor. So anything we talk about today, take it with a grain of salt and then bring that to your other conversations with your doc. Okay, so let's jump right into it. Cortisol. I think if we were in a room together and we were having a discussion, I'm sure everyone here would have lots of ideas and examples and information to offer about what is cortisol. I think we all have a sense that it is a stress hormone. So first and foremost, it is the hormone that gets released anytime our body encounters stress. Now, what we're going to learn about today and highlight and talk about is that stress can take on different forms. And that all those forms can have an equal sort of impact on that release of cortisol. But cortisol is one of those hormones that it can be very beneficial and very helpful for our body. It does help control inflammation. So I often explain to my patients, it's sort of like your body's innate form of prednisone. So if anyone's familiar with steroids, such as prednisone, which are very, very strong, much stronger than cortisol, but it's sort of the body's own way of suppressing inflammation to a degree. It's going to stimulate our sympathetic nervous system. So when we think about the human nervous system, we generally sort of categorize it into the sympathetic state, which is the fight, flight, or freeze. You encounter a tiger or a lion, or maybe nowadays, maybe it's something not quite so dramatic, and your body, the initial response is sort of that fight, flight, or freeze. And what happens there is a chain reaction of things. Your heart rate increases, some of your blood vessels will constrict, your pupils might dilate. You have a range of effects that cortisol will have on the body. We often think about cortisol, or it comes to mind when we think about sleep, or at least it does in my world, because I work with a lot of people where sleep is challenging, meaning sometimes people have difficulty falling asleep. Sometimes they have difficulty staying asleep. Sometimes they wake up too early in the morning and they can't get back to sleep. So I often have to explain to people, cortisol is one of those things where we don't necessarily want a high amount the whole day long, nor do we want too low of an amount. Cortisol generally peaks within about 30 to 45 minutes of waking up, and that's a good thing. That helps us wake up in the morning. It helps us become alert. Mentally, it kind of helps us prepare for the day. And then as the day goes on, cortisol levels will start to go down. And ideally, I explain to people in our deal world, cortisol levels sort of tank or bottom out around midnight. Now, there are some variations of this, of course. If I have patients who are working, say, night shift, and they consistently work night shift, meaning that's the only shift they work, I would expect their cortisol curve, as we call this, to be a little bit different, meaning instead of it being elevated when the sun rises in the morning, I would expect it to be lower, since that might be the time that they are getting ready to go to sleep. But for most people who work sort of the average 8 to 5, 9 to 5, or something where they're working in the morning and they're sleeping at night, sort of the rhythm of nature, the sun is up in the morning and it goes to sleep in the evening, or it goes down in the evening, we expect cortisol levels to be up. And then as they go down, our energy also goes down. And this is a natural thing to happen. This is a normal thing we want to have happen, because as cortisol levels go down, now that allows melatonin levels to go up. So melatonin and cortisol have sort of this dynamic relationship where if cortisol is up, melatonin will be low, and vice versa. So one thing to keep in mind or explain to people who have difficulty sleeping is that sometimes they're waking up in the middle of the night, or they have a hard time falling asleep, and it's because their cortisol levels are still really, really high at night. And so their melatonin levels just can't get up. And there's lots of natural ways to support melatonin levels, some of which we've talked about in past sessions. So we'll maybe revisit those a little later, but I'll encourage people to watch those other sessions because we go through some really specific examples. So cortisol is important. We do need cortisol. I mean, this is what helps us be awake and alert. It helps us manage inflammation. It helps us adapt to stress. Whether that stress is actually a tiger, which I think very few of us come into contact with nowadays. But maybe a stressor that's more realistic for many of us is maybe a deadline for work or for school. We have a lot of sort of self-imposed stressors, and then sometimes we have stressors from the outside that we can't control. And most of these stressors sort of have a quote unquote starting point and end point. So a tiger chases you, cortisol levels go up to help you run, flee the tiger, and then say you get away from the tiger, you have time to rest and recover, so your cortisol levels can go down. What I explain to people is cortisol's very, we don't want low cortisol levels all the time. We do need some highs and lows. And stress is also not necessarily a bad thing. So stress that comes and goes is part of what makes us human. It's part of what helps us grow stronger and develop new skills. At the same time, and in athletes, it will help develop strength. But if you have stress that continues and there's never time to rest or recover, you start to develop what we call chronic stress. And so chronic stress is something that can lead to a host of issues. And this is clinically what I see most in my practice. A lot of people will come in complaining of everything from weight gain, cognitive dysfunction. So what I mean by that is people often complain, I have like brain fog, or I have difficulty focusing or concentrating. Oftentimes people feel like they're in sympathetic overdrive. Chronically elevated cortisol levels, we just got done talking about how it sort of keeps inflammation low, or it can help suppress inflammation. But if we have chronically elevated cortisol levels, that can actually lead to a more inflamed state. Chronically elevated cortisol levels will also decrease immune function, and it'll start to deplete nutrients. So I thought this picture, when I saw this, I thought it felt really overwhelming. And that also felt like very appropriate when we think about all the things that can stress adrenals. Because sometimes when I see people, they're sort of thinking of one or two things, like they just think of emotional stress as stress. Whereas I try to explain to people, stress can be in various forms. And this isn't meant to overwhelm people to say, you know, you're doomed, you're going to have stress affecting you no matter what. That's not the point. The point is to actually say, you know, there are some things that we can try to control and some things we can modify. And then there are some things we can't. You know, I think we're becoming more aware, sort of in the mainstream sense, about the health impacts of psychological stress. Be that racism, you know, in terms of sexism in some areas, and that is now becoming more clear, now that they've actually developed some studies that have highlighted this, even though people have known this for a long, long time. But even relationship stress, you know, I talk a lot about this to people, you know, what are your relationships like? And then that's on top of other things that maybe we have more control over, whether that's lifestyle, you know, our diet. Those are two things I often talk to people about, because those feel like sort of low-hanging fruit, things that we can work on fairly easily. So again, chronically elevated cortisol ends up having a range of effects on the human body. So again, short bursts of cortisol spikes, okay, that's fine. You know, our body needs that to sort of recover or adapt to a stress. Once that stress is done, we want our body to be able to sort of return to a resting state, or what we also call the parasympathetic state. There's a reason why we call it the rest and digest state, the parasympathetic state, is because then our body can actually digest and absorb nutrients, and we can shunt blood back to various organs that maybe didn't get that blood when we were in our fight or flight state. But if your cortisol levels are chronically elevated and you don't have that time to rest or recover, just as I was talking about before, people can start to experience a range of symptoms. Now, sometimes they experience, you know, 2 or 3 of these symptoms. Sometimes they experience maybe 1 or 2. So sometimes that takes a little investigation on both the part of the patient or the individual and their healthcare provider to try to parse out what are the different things that might be aggravating me or might be stressing my adrenals. And I think it's something that's important to bring up and discuss with your healthcare provider, in part because sometimes the symptoms that come on can look like a lot of other things. And it's not to say that they're not these things, it's just that at the end of the day, we're always trying to look at why are these symptoms there. So again, some of the symptoms that come up are people come saying, you know, gosh, I can't sleep. They've been labeled or diagnosed with insomnia, and they can't really determine why, or nothing seems to really help. Weight gain, you know, and people seem to especially complain about, gosh, I've kind of put on weight around my belly, around where my navel is. It's no matter how much I exercise or eat different foods or eat perfectly, it just doesn't budge. We have to remember high blood pressure can be a result of chronically stressed adrenals and elevated cortisol levels. Likewise, depression and anxiety. You know, cortisol has a relationship to both sex hormones and also all of the different neurotransmitters. And when cortisol levels go up, they will also stimulate parts of the adrenal gland to secrete things like catecholamines. So those are things like epinephrine, norepinephrine, and those can make people feel anxious. Conversely, you know, if someone's been in sort of an anxious state for a long period of time, eventually they might actually fall into a depression or a state of depression. And I try to explain, you know, sometimes the body is so exhausted from being anxious all the time that it's the body's natural response to that. Again, a lot of people have sort of the wired but tired feeling. They're like, gosh, I'm so exhausted, but I just can't turn my brain off at the end of the day. And then, like I was saying before, difficulty focusing. Some people call it like a brain fog, like, gosh, I just feel like my head's in the clouds. I just can't think straight. Maybe some memory issues. I also find a lot of people have increased food sensitivities. And for those that were with us in our talk a couple of weeks ago, we talked a little bit about food sensitivities and different types of food allergies. And I was explaining how some people sort of develop these, what I'd call functional sensitivities to food, meaning they're not really allergic to a food, but because their immune system has become dysregulated due to stress, their body seems to lose tolerance to food. So they seem reactive no matter what they eat. They're like, God, it doesn't matter what I eat. I seem to get gassy, bloated. I just can't seem to tolerate anything. And oftentimes you see lots of hunger and cravings. Some people say, oh, I crave salty foods all the time, sweet foods. Some people crave high protein foods. Sometimes appetite gets suppressed, it just depends. And lastly, I see a lot of people, have difficulty healing from injuries, or they're frequently getting ill. Like they always seem to be fighting something, like a case of the sniffles or maybe sore throat. And it's not anything acute, like it's not a case of strep or anything like that, but their immune system is just constantly fighting something. And there's certainly more symptoms that could fall under this list. I'm sure if we were having a conversation, we'd come up with more, but these are the most common ones that I see. So how can we regulate cortisol levels? And this is the great, and this is where we get to dive in a little bit more deeply. And I'm going to focus on the top two here, which is not to say the other points below are not important, but I think I really don't want to bypass or overlook the very simple but yet profound effects that the first two things can have on regulating cortisol levels. And the reason why I want to highlight and focus on these is because oftentimes people are looking for a solution, or they're looking for a fix to the problem. And I see far too often in the world where I work that the first thing people are often reaching for is like a supplement or some type of medication. And that's not to say that those are not helpful or necessary at many points in many times. However, if we bypass some of the more basic things, some of the more foundational pieces, I find that those other types of support have limited value, meaning they will work only for so long, or they might not work that well. They work a little bit. So in order to help everything else work even better, we really want to try to implement some basic things. And so I've provided this short list here. I'm sure we could even talk about even more things, more options that there are for regulating cortisol levels. It can be subjective. There are a growing number of studies highlighting the benefits of any one of these. However, you'll see some of the evidence is sort of limited, or it's still in development. And sometimes every individual is different, and what stresses one individual might calm another. So deep belly breathing. This is something that I think most of us are familiar with and understand and know. And many of you may already do this, which is fantastic. I know it's something that, I've been familiar with and have practiced meditation at various forms in my life. And then later stages, I've been like, oh yeah, don't forget about breathing, just breathing. You can't live without breath for very long, at least. And this just highlights, there are many studies out there about the benefits of meditation or mindful breathing or diaphragmatic breathing. But one study showed, 20 sessions over the course of 8 weeks, an average of 4 breaths per minute. Now, I'm highlighting this study, but honestly, I don't think you need to follow any one particular study. What I think the important thing to take away from this is that in nearly every study that you look at, that's out there, they're going to show they're all going to show some degree of this point right here, which is they notice improved attention, improved affect or mood, improved cortisol levels, and then you're going to see some other some other factors or some other, data points that they'll measure, like blood pressure, pulse rate. Those are very common points that they'll measure, data points. Also temperature, body temperature is another one that people will use to sort of look at or see, am I in a relaxed state? And there are some biofeedback tools that you can get for home use. Obviously, there are some that can be used in a clinical setting, but I try to explain to patients that you don't need anything fancy. We can be very low tech here. And as little as 5 minutes twice a day can have a positive impact. And I'd argue that even less you could do and still have a positive impact. So sometimes if focused or mindful breathing is new to someone and they're not really comfortable with that idea, or if there's someone who's maybe done a lot of meditation in the past, but they've kind of fallen away from their practice, I say, why don't we start at your own pace? So don't worry about counting your breath. Just make it whatever breathing pace works for you. And I explain to people there's various techniques you can use. For some people, it feels helpful to do this in a seated position or when they're lying down. And the biggest thing is just to allow your belly to expand when you breathe in or inhale, and then allow your belly to sort of fall down as you exhale. And the biggest thing is try not to force anything. Just sort of watch what you notice in your body. And the idea of the belly breathing, or allowing your belly to expand when you inhale, is to really, it's not like you're putting air into your belly, of course, but what it is allowing us to do is engage that diaphragm, which sits between your lungs and the rest of your abdomen. It sort of separates the two cavities. And when we do that, we help sort of expand our lung capacity, which has many benefits. So again, if someone is looking for ideas, there are both high tech and low tech. And I don't think you need to do high tech, but I know some people, the apps are really helpful for them because it holds them accountable. So they might set their phone, put an app on their phone, whether it's Calm or Headspace or UCLA Mindful. There's countless number of apps that all have similar activities or options on them, which is you can do something as simple as you'll be guided through someone's voice, kind of guiding you through a mindfulness meditation. Sometimes they just help you count your breath in and out. Now that we have it and we've developed it, I encourage people to utilize the YouTube channel. It's free. It's available to anyone who has an internet access, and you can go on and for 5 to 15 minutes, you can let someone else help guide you into that mindful space where nearly every single time there's going to be some attention to breath. Also for youth, they've developed, there's a program, I haven't used it yet. It looks very exciting, called Chillfish. And I've heard good things about it. So that's something that's more specific to youth with diagnosis of ADHD. What I explain to people on plans when I'm outlining recommendations for people is I say, maybe just start with 1 or 2 deep conscious belly breaths when you wake up in the morning, before each meal, and then before bed at night. Those are just natural times when we are transitioning into the day. Another time when we're about to eat our food. And as we talked about in the last couple sessions ago, mindful eating to support digestive function and optimal absorption of our nutrients. So that 1 or 2 deep belly breaths before you take your first bite of food helps get your body into that parasympathetic state so you can optimize your digestion. And then of course at night before bed, where we really try to get our nervous system into that parasympathetic state so we can fully rest and recover. So just as a reminder, if at any point you have any questions or you want to share any thoughts or experiences, you're more than welcome to put them in the chat column for those that are attending the live session. Now we're going to talk about nature therapy. And what I love about these two things is you can often combine them together. So you can, as one of my former teachers used to say, feed 2 birds with 1 seed. You can get the benefits of nature therapy and get the benefits of breath work or conscious breathing. You can do both when you're outside. What I love about nature therapy is this is inherent to the type of medicine that I studied. And what's amazing is nowadays we are seeing an increasing amount of literature that's coming out where people are actually studying the effects of exposure to nature. And this is just absolutely lovely because I think it's something we all sort of intuitively know is good for us. But sometimes it's hard to give ourselves permission to do so. So what's been sort of in the news more in the past year, especially the past couple of years, is forest bathing, which is another term that's used in Japan. So Shinrin Yoku. And this sort of really highlighted the benefits of nature therapy. And the idea is that, there are various studies, but one in particular where they looked at people who went for a walk in a forest environment, is how they labeled it, for 15 minutes. And it was really amazing because the group that went into the forest area had lower cortisol levels, lower pulse rate. Over time, for groups that did this over the course of months, they had a reduction of blood glucose levels, so helped manage diabetes. And interestingly enough, they found it was sort of a natural aromatherapy. So in today's day and age, we have so much talk about things like essential oils, which, I could do a whole talk about, the benefits and, some of the risks with those. I think what essential oils are basically trying to do is give us what we typically would get from nature, because many of the plants that we encounter in nature are always releasing different aromas. Their natural oils are coming out of their leaves and seedlings and whatnot, and we're actually experiencing that real time. Now, some people, I think, understandably, we have different exposure, like the ability to be exposed to nature. Some people live in the country where they feel like they live amongst nature. So for them, this is like what they do every day. Some people maybe live in the suburbs where you're relatively close to nature and it feels like you've got a relatively good amount of green space surrounding you. And then there are those of us that live in an urban setting where we may have to work a little bit harder to try to find green spaces. Now, being someone who's grown up and lived in urban spaces for much of my life, I can appreciate sometimes the challenges depending on where you live. If you live in an apartment, if you live in a house with a yard, if you live near a nature setting or not near a nature setting, sometimes we have to be creative. So I always explain to people, if we just start thinking about it and bring it to our consciousness, you'll realize that at least in Minneapolis or the Twin Cities area and in Minnesota as a whole, we have a relatively good amount of green space, even in our urban areas. We're relatively close to those green spaces. Now, sometimes we're not aware of them. And so I think we can do more to inform people about where those are. But the good news is we have them, and we have a lot of public green spaces that are free to access. I have some people that, especially once we hit the colder months, they're like, or even the hot summer months when it's very, very hot and muggy out there, people are like, that just does not work for me. Or they might have various health conditions that really, it might put them at risk to be outdoors for more than a couple minutes a day. And I explain to them, what's interesting is there's actually literature and research that shows you can still get the same benefit from nature just by watching it. And so I'll say to people, go ahead and, pick a window in one of the rooms of your home. And it doesn't necessarily have to look out to a beautiful waterfall park or anything like that. Sometimes we have to find and appreciate the nature that we do have near us. And maybe that little bit of nature is a tree outside of your window. Maybe it's a patch of grass outside of your window. Maybe there's a little flower garden nearby. And I encourage people to just watch that piece of nature, that green space, or that plant or that tree for 5-10 minutes a day. And there's no attachment to what you're getting out of that. Just observe it. And over time, of course, you're going to watch that plant or that area sort of evolve with the seasons. So there's some benefit in that, but just the mere act of watching nature from inside your home can still have that beneficial impact on your cortisol levels. And of course, many people here know the benefits of gardening. Many here probably do gardening already. It's sort of a nice therapeutic, meditative way to spend your time. So sometimes I'll go out and just sort of hang out with the flowers, or, try to clean things up in my very messy garden. But for those who maybe don't have gardens at their home, they might join a community garden space and participate in that. And then lastly, of course, being in nature or green spaces where you're just fully immersed in terms of every sense, your sight, your smell, your feel. And like I was saying, sometimes part of what I'm doing is, many of my patients they teach me about all the places I don't know about in Minnesota, which is great. I learn so much. And then there are some people that they haven't had the same exposure to that, and that's okay too. It's great to highlight all the different resources we have. We have many recreational parks, nature parks within the city, and then clearly outstate, we have numerous. And I also highlight, a few different websites. And interestingly enough, Park RX America. So this is a newer organization. I think it's been taking a little while to get off the ground, but this is actually designed for doctors to utilize to prescribe nature to their patients. And it's really fascinating. I hope it continues to take off. I love the idea of using this. I was prescribing nature to people before this came on board, but I love this because it really helps. In my mind, it allows me to really direct my patients. I need you to get in nature. It's not a soft recommendation. This is a necessary recommendation. And as I said, Minneapolis Parks and Rec Board, each community, be it in Ramsey County or St. Paul or the northern suburbs or the southern suburbs, each community has their Parks and Rec Board. Sometimes they're combined with other communities, but usually you'll see here are some of the resources we have available, and most of them are low to no cost. So it's really available and accessible to everybody. And they're also, all websites are also very good about highlighting accessibility, both financially, most all are low cost, but then also physical accessibility. Most of the state and federal resources have been made accessible, or at least they highlight which trails are accessible by wheelchair, maybe for blind or deaf and hard of hearing. So they try to make it accessible to everyone. So before I move on, I want to make sure we just have a few minutes left, and I want to go back before we wrap up and talk a little bit about some things that I don't necessarily have slides on, but I think are very important. And that is these last 3 points right here. So positive social interactions, this is something where it's not necessarily documented in the literature, but I think most of us can relate to the benefits of it. And sometimes this is with friends and family. Sometimes this is with, social groups. Maybe it's a book club, maybe it's a hiking club. But most people can attest to the benefits on mood and overall stress levels when they're with people. And oftentimes you can combine that with spending time in nature. Maintaining stable blood sugar, I'm just going to mention briefly because we've talked about this in past sessions. So if you missed any of those past sessions, I encourage you to go back and listen to those, because we talk a lot about how to maintain that stable blood sugar. I explain to people, if your blood sugar is going up and down, or if you're going too long without eating, you're going to find it stresses your adrenals more. Interestingly enough, a lot of times I notice people who have been suffering from chronic stress will note, if I don't eat every 1 or 2 hours, I feel like I'm going to crash. So they've already started to see the effects. The adrenals help support stabilizing blood sugar levels throughout the day, and therefore energy levels. So if you've suffered from chronic stress for a long period of time, that can start to impact your ability to go more than a few hours without food. Or interestingly enough, some people will use things like coffee or other stimulants to sort of keep themselves going. And then lastly, acupuncture, Tai Chi, yoga, Qigong. I mean, these are just a handful of mindful activities that we all can utilize. And, any one of these is not for everybody. Everybody's going to find what fits them and works for them and resonates for them. I highlight these, of course, because, you know, my bias is I do acupuncture. I love it. I think a lot of people benefit from it, but may not be for everyone. I know Tai Chi and yoga, these are things that Debbie Cohen has been doing throughout the summer, and those are also on our YouTube channel. You know, for acupuncture, I know we have continued to offer this resource and will be back in the clinic now starting this week at our St. Louis Park clinic. So for those who are like, I think acupuncture, I'd like to try it out, that is an option. There are many acupuncturists around the state of Minnesota. We luckily have 2 schools in the state of Minnesota where that train acupuncturists. So there are many options to consider. But right now, our big announcement is that acupuncture, we previously had it at the behavioral health clinic for families. And we're waiting to get back into that clinic. But while we're waiting, we are now in the St. Louis Park clinic. And so we'll be there 2 days a week now. Your people can come in as a referral from their provider, but you can also self-refer. And this is insurance-based. So if you have a private insurance, you can always ask your insurance company if they cover acupuncture. If they do, clarify what, you know, sorts of conditions do you cover, because sometimes they only cover a handful. If you have something like medical assistance or Medicare, that will cover acupuncture for most conditions, which is really great. And as a reminder, there are ongoing mind-body training sessions and health coaching sessions with both Teresa Newt and Debbie Cohen, who are wonderful providers and wonderful human beings. And these, again, these are all ways to help people get in touch with and become familiar with what sorts of mind-body routines could work for them. So they're really sort of teaching sessions where you get to learn more about yourself and what works for you, so that you can take that home and use that on your own. And then lastly, for those that haven't already joined our listserv, you can join our mailing list by emailing psychwellness@umn.edu. You can stay informed about all of our classes that we'll be having in the future. We'll likely be doing some workshops this fall. You'll also stay abreast of integrative service offerings. So again, the acupuncture, the mind-body sessions, health coaching sessions, and in the future, we'll be doing some naturopathic and functional medicine appointments. So for those on the live event today, I want to encourage you, give you one last chance to ask any lingering questions or provide any comments that came up for you during today's session. You know, what are your favorite types of cortisol lowering activities, or is there anything that you found surprising that we talked about today? Or was everything pretty highlighted things that you've already been doing? And I'll give everyone just another minute while you can appreciate. This is a picture of the sunset that I took one day, and this was just outside of our recreational center nearby, and you're in the middle of the city, yet here we have nature. So it was one of those days where it had been a very busy day, lots of stress, and at the end of the day, just sort of took this moment to appreciate the sunset. Probably took maybe 5 seconds to take a deep belly breath as I looked at this, and then afterwards snapped a picture, of course. But it just is a reminder that nature is all around us. We just need to see it, appreciate it, and be conscious of it. So.
Thank you very much. I was going to share that deep breathing has been very important. I've been doing that and using that. I would love to do the other ones as well. I think the social interaction is very important. I think that is going to be, that has been tough during COVID with everybody being sheltered by themselves. I had a question regarding acupuncture.
Please.
If that is something somebody would like to try, is that something you do like maybe once, especially if you think about chronic stress, or is it something you maybe do a weekly session or you train yourself?
That's a really good question. Thanks for asking that. For acupuncture, it is one of those things where I explain to people, it depends. It can definitely be used ongoing. So say in the case of chronic stress, when I'm working with someone who is suffering from chronic stress and we don't really see those stressors going anywhere, what I do is I first evaluate how they're responding to the acupuncture. So if they're new to acupuncture, I say, let's try 3 to 4 sessions weekly if we can, because that helps me understand how your body's responding and how the rest of your mental emotional body is responding to it. And usually by about that third or fourth treatment, we have a sense of, yes, I find myself getting into a really relaxed state during sessions. Or, I didn't feel much the first session, but after the second and third session, I felt better. And sometimes, there's always those people by the third and fourth session, they're like, I'm just not feeling anything. Like I'm just lying there and it's not doing anything for me. And so I say to people, depending on where you sit on that spectrum, if you're one of those people that finds it very calming and relaxing, then I say we might want to develop a schedule for you. So if we know things are going to be higher stress, even though it might seem counterintuitive, I'm going to say, why don't you try to get in as frequently as possible? Meaning usually that looks like weekly or every other weekly. And what that ends up being is it sort of forces people to have quiet time, and it sort of forces them to get out of their brain and into their body for that 30 to 45 minutes. And then I almost call it like a power nap for some people, because they get into such a relaxed state. And sometimes people don't even, they're like, I can't believe how quickly that time went. And then all of a sudden you came back in the room. So for some people, it can be quite remarkable in helping them manage stress. Now, if someone's coming in to see me for the first time and I don't notice, I'm not seeing the shifts that I would expect them to see, or I'm not seeing the benefit I would expect, what I will say is, acupuncture can vary from provider to provider. I'm going to encourage you to see another provider and see if you have a different experience with them. It could be my style, maybe it's not, maybe it's just acupuncture in you, but why don't we try that? Lastly, I'll say, I have some people where getting in for a weekly appointment or even every other weekly it feels like that's not possible for them, maybe because of scheduling or financial or various factors. So that's when I say, okay, let's get you in. Maybe you can come in monthly for an appointment once a month. Those other days and weeks between appointments, I'm going to give you some activities to take home with you. And so that usually involves a series of some Qigong activities where we're doing kind of a shaking. Often we're tapping the channels, the acupuncture channels, or doing acupressure, which you can apply to yourself. So there's many different ways that acupuncture can be sort of accessed by any individual, but I usually encourage people to start with the process by seeing a licensed acupuncturist, but plan on, maybe 3 to 4 to maybe 6 sessions at the most to kind of understand what it's doing for you. You might not be 100% better after 6 sessions, but you're at least going to know what your body's response is and what kind of schedule you'll need ongoing. I hope, does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Oh, great. Any other questions, comments? We have just another minute or two here. Well, you all have been amazing today. Thank you so much for joining me. I really enjoyed today's session. I've really enjoyed these wellness breaks over the summer. Again, I encourage you, if you haven't had the chance to listen to the other ones, please head over to YouTube and listen to those. I hope you get something out of them. And keep on the lookout. We'll be having more events and offerings going into the fall and winter. We're going to try to keep our community connected with or without COVID. So thank you all for joining me. I hope you have a lovely rest of the day.